Hey, do you want to go into some random break fan for 41 minutes and 46 seconds and talk about Edward?
What? Wait, what? Hello, everybody, and welcome to Track Stars. Um, well, you want to introduce yourself?
No, you should introduce yourself.
Okay, my name is Jaden, aka the Wooden Robot,
I am Mr. Tugboat.
aka
Um,
Mr. Tugboat. So Roman here and I saw. So basically, we saw the podcast Character Gallery by Here the Japanese Train and of course Lemmy. If you haven't seen that, go check it out. It's amazing, and we liked
interesting.
it a lot, right? And
Yes, and it was quite a
yeah,
major inspiration.
and
Um,
so we basically decided to copy it because we wanted to do it, and it's
and
such a
like,
fun idea, and I
talking
love
about
it so much.
characters isn't anything original by anybody. It's really
Yeah,
talking about Thomas and Friends characters, and I don't think anybody could copyright that, even if you tried
yeah,
to. Um, and people do it offhandedly all the time, and like have their own. Some people have their own character analysis, like videos and stuff, but like it's all like scripted and formatted. And if
right.
we were to do scripted and formatted character analysis stuff, well, we wouldn't, and it would never get out. Um,
The
However,
cycle.
we talk to each other more frequently than we finish projects, so we
Yeah.
figured this would probably be a better way to go about it.
It's like a mix of both, basically. So
Yeah.
hopefully this gets out to you all if you're listening to this, and that's probably a good sign. Also, I think we have a better name, maybe. No, actually, Character Galley's better. Character, I guess. Yeah.
Character Gallery is like it's iconic. Track
Yeah.
Stars is like
It's
it's like
fine. It
sneakier to Character
functions,
Gallery's
but
day.
it's not
Yeah, like
Character Gallery.
the Character Gallery. It's like it's very
They
nostalgic.
got there
Track Stars
first.
is an obscure DVD reference. Yeah, they got there first,
So,
and I'm very bitter about it, even
so
though
with
I
all that
love the show.
aside, we are here today to talk about everybody's favorite number two engine,
Rebecca.
Rebecca. No, Edward. Edward is the engine of the
What?
day.
Edward's number two.
Believe it or not.
Whoa.
Um, yeah, it's crazy. I know. Revelations today, guys.
Um.
So I know that Roman has some hot takes about Edward that you guys will
Well,
not be expecting.
for an example, I guess would be I don't think Edward not getting episodes as frequently as everybody else, or him getting NPC episodes even. You
Yeah.
know, where anyone could fill. I don't think that's a bad thing, or at least not to the same extent as everybody else does.
I mean, I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing. It's just, at least he is getting episodes, but he's not getting good episodes necessarily, which
Well,
really doesn't help his character.
well, no, but we'll get more into that. Like the more we discuss Edward, like we'll get into that in a little bit.
Okay, okay.
I feel like we can get more in depth once we've defined Edward and yada yada yada.
So who is Edward in your eyes?
Um, Edward is this straight man. I think is the best way to describe him.
Okay,
Like
yeah.
I wouldn't simply because of like this is going to sound really weird, and I don't even agree with what I'm going to say here. But Edward, I wouldn't be straight away to call him like a wise old sage, more so as I would like a straight man. Because if you think about
Yeah.
all the stuff that Edward's done, specifically in the classic era, is that's the stuff we appreciate the most. It's all like very simple solutions. Like, oh, someone needs help up a hill. I'll go help them. Oh, a friend is feeling sad. I'll
Yeah,
support them.
yeah.
This is
I
what
mean,
I
like
believe about you and yada yada.
something that people in the community seem to gloss over or just outright ignore a lot is that Edward has flaws. Believe it or not, Edward does have flaws. Um, he's not just like the perfect saintly persona who all the characters go to for advice, and like he's all knowing and he knows every all
Right.
knowing.
Right. I hmm. Edward having flaws, like it's not expanded on. At least not very much.
hmm
Um, in the show, but you can definitely, if you do a little bit of reading between the lines, you can like see and I don't want to say fill in gaps, but you can definitely see like Edward's flaws peek through on certain
Right.
occasions. Like
Yeah.
Edward's little bit of racism towards cranes.
Yeah, in that episode that everybody hates, but I mean it adds a layer to Edward, which while it may not be
I
the
don't know.
best layer, it's still something. It's better than most of
That's
Edward's episodes
that's true. Edward
in that
strikes out as
regard.
very an interesting case, just because it's like, yeah, it doesn't line up with what we've seen from Edward so far.
Mhm.
And it especially doesn't line up with how the fandom has characterized him. Um, but it kind of makes sense for an older engine like Edward to be maybe not to the same degree as he's depicted, but skeptical of newer
Yeah.
technologies. Like
Skeptical is
if
a
you
good
look at Rocky
word.
next to the breakdown train, Rocky looks like he's from a whole nother time period.
Right.
Which I mean he probably is, but
And I mean, with, dieselization, branch lines closing, everything happening around that time that this would probably be taking place, it would make sense for Edward to, but like you said, be
be a little bit more
skeptical of
skeptical.
this new technology.
Edward, I said something about this a second ago.
Uh-huh.
Um, and I'm gonna dive more in depth into that. Edward being like a wise sage isn't really like a thing in the show. Like if you look at it
Yeah.
from what actually happens, it's all very basic. Basically, he's not crazy. Um, like I think the
Yeah.
most wise sage thing he did was like tell Percy to talk to the Fat Controller. But even then, that's like an older brother type thing. That's not like a particularly older
Yeah.
sage type. Like I wouldn't associate that with like Master Yoda or somebody who's iconically supposed to be the old wise teacher, you know?
Right. And like I mean, of course, don't get me wrong. I think Edward is definitely a mentor figure.
Oh
He's
yeah,
just
absolutely.
not he's just not exactly this to the same degree as many people depict him as, in my opinion. Like, I mean, if you
Yeah.
look at his debut, the debut story of the entire franchise, that's just Edward getting a day out of the sheds and helping Gordon up a hill and stuff. That doesn't show him being all knowing and like this saintly
Yeah,
figure.
right. Um, I am more inclined to say that I almost prefer the fandom's version of Edward. And I say the fandom's version of Edward very specifically to differentiate the fact between Audrey's Edward, who I don't think was meant to be like an old grandpa wise sort of, all knowing beings. And I
Yeah.
think the fandom definitely put that trait upon Edward a lot more than can be inferred, I guess.
Yeah.
Um, but I like Wise Edward. I think it makes sense, and it's nice to have somebody who's more than just straight-headed in the main cast. Because especially when we get into like the later years of even the model series, um, everybody kind of does everything.
Mhm.
Um, so it's nice to have somebody who was, you know, more consistent's not the word, but you know what I mean.
Right. Yeah, I mean, if you look at like Thomas in the Hitter, he's constantly going back and forth between helping other characters be really mature and then going off and thinking that a snowman balloon is a real snowman following him around. And
Exactly. Granted, Edward wasn't exactly the most consistent, um, in terms of how he's appeared in past with like if you're just looking at what what he's shown to be like in
mhm.
previous stories. Stuff like Edward Strikes Out really doesn't fit at all.
Oh, of course.
Um, so Edward doesn't quite fit the mold either, but I feel like he is closer to being like a wiser sage in like the later eras, um, than he is
So
like
so going back to
now.
the fandom's uh idea of Edward as you described, you would consider that as a wise sage, no?
Yeah, I'd consider Edward in the fandom to be a wiser type.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think the way that I like my Edward, if I were to describe it as like I don't know a drink mixture or something, is basically he he tries to help, right? And he's always the one who's like giving out advice and stuff, but he just can't quite like a lot of the time he can't quite get it right, I guess. He I said before Edward has flaws, and that's more or less what I'm saying here. He cannot always give perfect advice because that's just boring. That doesn't he doesn't have a character arc or anything like that. And I mean, I'm
Right,
not saying that every character needs a character arc. It's just something another layer of interest to add on to him.
right. Um, Edward having flaws is like a strange topic to touch on because all his flaws come from his inconsistencies, but nobody likes his inconsistencies.
Right. It's
So it's
like
hard to like push the two together, but yeah. I also think
yeah.
Edward is like he is like patient, but because of what we see in inconsistency, I'm also inclined to believe that he's like impatient when it comes to like more important stuff, I should say.
Mhm.
Like if there's like a special train or something and he doesn't get it, that doesn't bother him in the slightest. You know,
Right, yeah, of
he had
course.
his time. But when somebody else is like actively doing something to like sabotage somebody or is like being, not good, um, I feel like Edward gets rather impatient then, um, strictly because of like how much advice he's given these engines over the years.
Yeah.
It's always the main characters too. It's never like some random
It's,
one-off side
it's never
character.
it's never Billy.
No, Billy and Edward never interact, and I feel like if they did, Billy would not be like at all hated.
Billy would not be how
I
he
feel like,
is.
yeah, I feel like if Edward and Billy were to have met, I feel like for whatever reason my brain just fills in that Billy would like have some sort of respect for Edward. Just be like, oh yeah, you know what? That's fair. I was being a dick, and then he would just
Even though
stop
that's
and
really
become
not what would happen, but that's
no,
besides the
absolutely
point.
not. But like they also didn't meet, so I don't think it matters at all what I think
Yeah.
happened or what didn't happen or could have happened.
I mean, that's sort of the thing. A lot of in like the Hitter, a lot of what would be Edward roles, according to like the fandom's definition and whatnot, are replaced with Thomas in the same characterization just because that's how he is in the Hedera. He's the main
Right.
character. And Edward, who would be the mentor in these roles with like, you know, telling Billy not to be stupid or telling Dennis to do his work or whatever, that that's given to Thomas because it's you can't have two side characters being the main characters in their own story in the Hedera. You have to have the main character interacting with somebody else.
Right. I feel like had Edward appeared like say they hadn't given Edward any episodes at all in the Hit era, and he only had like his few like side appearances, like in Chickens to School, where he just
Mm-hmm.
roast Gordon. He had like those few minor appearances throughout the seasons, and Thomas was strictly the straight man, wise sage main character type.
Yeah.
Like how he is in the Dennis episode and Don't Be Silly Billy. I feel like
Yeah.
I feel like I'd be more okay with that because that would have shown effectively that would have continued Thomas's season 5 persona,
Yeah.
which, if you think about it in a longer fashion, is almost Edward's fault that Thomas is that way. Because as far as we've seen, Thomas and Edward never have ever had like issues, and he's always looked up to Edward. So
Yeah. I
I
mean,
feel like it would
it's
be
almost like sorry. It's almost like throughout the years, Edward has just morphed the other characters into versions of him, therefore
well,
writing himself out.
monkey see, monkey do, though. So it's okay.
Yeah, though, actually, speaking of writing Edward out, I know that you have another hot take that might be worthy of some discussion in this.
Oh, I don't think writing Edward out at all was like a bad idea. And I feel him taking Philip with him to Wellsworth, aside from the geographical inconsistency, um, I don't think that would have been a bad idea. Because the show does this itself. It like makes reference to this, but for whatever reason, people still like obsess over the fact that it's Philip. And fair enough, I don't like Philip that much either. But like, look
But
at
he's a character in need of mentoring. That's the thing.
yeah, like look at how Thomas was in The Adventure Begins. Basically, if you gave Thomas ADHD in that movie and just turned him into a diesel, you'd have Philip. So,
Basically.
like, there's not much of a difference between where Thomas started and where Philip is.
So I
So,
mean that.
Edward going to Wellsworth, which he stayed at all the time in the books. Like, we barely saw Edward at Tidmouth
Yeah.
in the books. He was at Wellsworth. It's called Edward Station for a reason. Um,
So I mean,
and
really, there's no
Philip
better
with
way
him,
they could have written out Edward.
right? And Edward, like, finding a place to, like, Edward helps engines all the time. It is basically his full-time job. Working on the railway is like a hobby. Um, Otherwise, it's just the railway's therapist.
Alright. That's
Um,
why that's why he's still on the railway, just to be the
exactly.
therapist.
Yeah, exactly. Because think about this logically. Who are the main characters? We have Thomas. He's a cheeky prick most of the time, but eventually grows to be quite snobby. Who else is there? There's Gordon. I don't think I need to explain anything for why Gordon's going to be a conflict issue. Henry, who bounces back and forth between snobby, arrogant big engine and gentle giant. There's
Who's a
James, vain,
screaming
smug,
Pomeranian.
loud, obnoxious. There's Percy, the devil himself when it comes to pranks.
And
Like,
also naive. Both at the
exactly.
same time.
And then there's Toby. And what does he do to stop everyone? Nothing. He eggs them on.
That's
Right.
yeah, it's like Toby and Edward are both there to be therapists and then Toby's just sitting back in
Toby,
a lounge
Toby
chair
looks
and
like
drinking some
underdogs.
whiskey.
Exactly. Like if there's about to be a fight, Toby is going to sit there, watch, and occasionally when it starts going to like calm down, he'll be like, "Oh, come on, I was here for a show." It
Yeah.
would be disappointing. So like I'm pretty sure there wouldn't be a season two if Edward wasn't around. Because it's all
They would
conflict
have killed each
brothers.
other.
Exactly. They would have just killed each other by 1986. Um
That's why Edward has to be
so
there.
exactly, because then we need multiple seasons of this thing, and if Edward's not here, um
Just every time they turn the cameras off, Edward would go over to the engines and be like, "Okay, you just need to calm down a little, okay?"
of course they never would, but
It
yeah.
just the
So
thought. It's the thought that counts.
yeah. So Edward kind of like being the therapist is like fitting. And for him to not only have an issue that like one isn't his fault, like
Hmm.
he didn't tell James to stop doing the break thing or anything, but like he's a victim of James being an idiot, you know? This isn't
Yeah.
nothing new, but like it's just an Edward thing. And then him finally getting help from somebody else. Philip of all characters, who is at the time the most mentor needing engine, is like honestly kind of heart touching that like
Yeah.
Philip, like you can see there's goodness in Philip, and it's like yeah, okay. And in the very same episode, he's like, hey, come to my shed, please. I'll be quiet this time. You know, I
Yeah.
feel like that's so nice of him, and like Edward taking up the mantle to start mentoring Philip properly. Um, before Bubba, of course, where they just totally destroyed all that, but
We
that's
don't
not
talk about
important.
Bubba here.
We don't talk about Bubba. Insert we don't talk about Bruno meme here.
Oh my god.
Yeah, so
Give it like 30 years or so, and then Philip will just have taken Edward's role.
exactly. Like that
Only
I'm
problem
pretty
being that none of
sure
the engines would respect that.
no, probably not. But like that would be quite the funny scenario. Like Edward is long gone by this point. He's like passed away or whatever else. I don't know, retired. And
Yeah.
Philip is there, like trying to teach Gordon to be a better engine. And
Yeah.
Gordon was there when Philip thought he like won a race. Still, like nobody
He'll
would
never
take it
let
serious.
that go.
No, never, never once.
Though, what you just said does remind me of something. Do you feel like Edward would be better off, like, in given the whole overarching plot, right? Everybody's character arcs, like Gordon's really long, series long character arc, etc. That Edward should retire or just keep working or what?
Well, I feel that eventually he's gonna get too old for it. I know Skarloey and
Mm-hmm.
Rheneas exist, but the Skarloey Railway doesn't have the same amount of traffic as the Northwestern. Like
Yeah.
they went a solid what 20 years? No, they went like 50. So it's like yeah, 18 like 60 something to like the 50s without a new engine
Yeah.
versus the Northwestern where it's like a every few years thing.
Yeah,
So
because
I
the
don't
workload
think
just keeps
like
getting bigger.
pardon?
The workload just keeps getting bigger.
Exactly. So like like I don't think there would be I think there would be a time in some future where it would just become too much for engines like Edward
Mm-hmm.
and he would retire. And by that point of course everyone's matured or as
Philip's
mature
there to
as
take his role.
Philip's there to pretend to be wise. Gordon's not quite a douche anymore. Thomas has stopped being, Thomas. James is painted blue. The whole shebang. Um,
Sure.
um,
James now runs the
everyone's on,
Brendan branch. alongside
We're,
Philip.
we'll get. Oh my gosh! Shut up. We're not going to talk about that. But like the point being, I feel like the day Edward retires is like the day there stops being conflict on Sodor, which would be really nice to see. Well, I mean, for like the actual engines, for us, that'd make a really, really lame show.
Yeah.
Um, it wouldn't be half as interesting if there was just never conflict. But
Well then,
if, I feel like the day there wasn't conflict, Edward would retire. He'd be like, okay, we're all cool with each other now. There hasn't been an argument in the last 37 minutes, 54 seconds. I'm done for a while, and he would just like just stop for a bit.
I
Like I could
mean,
still see him doing like occasional trains on his branch line, but like I don't think he would be full service.
that does sort of beg the question. What do you think would happen if Edward was forced out of it early? Like, I don't know, retired or killed or whatever. Like
I think
he had some sort of big malfunction and he was pulled out of service while everybody is still in the bastard era.
well, I think let's take Edward's exploit for example, because I think that's the closest he's gotten to like, death.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think there would almost be I don't know if a frenzy is the word, but it would certainly become more
Heated.
cryptic, heated, yeah. Because like Gordon, as much as he wouldn't want to show it, he would be he would likely be deeply impacted by this.
Oh, of
Because
course.
like Edward's been there since he was on Sodor. I could honestly imagine Edward having like taught Gordon a little bit about passengers, you know?
Yeah, I wouldn't be
And
surprised.
they've had so much, for lack of a better term, banter.
They've had
And
a lot of
like
history.
yeah, they've had history together. And considering what Edward is functionally, like as a locomotive,
Mm-hmm.
and considering when Edward's exploit happens, which is like the 60s,
Yeah.
which is when all Gordon's brothers are dying. I feel like it would just shake Gordon up more. And I don't know if regress is the word, but it would definitely take him a lot longer to get to where he is in like Christopher Audrey's books, where he's not quite a douche. As for
I
engines like
mean,
Henry and like, oh, sorry, go on.
Philip aside, do you think that somebody would step up and fill his role, or do you think that it would just go as a void and everybody would just sort of stagnate?
Well, that's a good question. I feel like in the canon of the universe, there could be potential. Fillers isn't the right word because I don't think there would be another engine not just as important to Sodor as Edward was or
Mm-hmm.
has been, but like I don't think there would just be another engine who could have the same sort of impact on everybody else. Because if you look throughout the book specifically, every book at least has one interaction. The main character has one interaction with Edward. Like Thomas the Tank Engine, obviously, there's, Thomas and the Trucks exists. Um, Gordon the Big Engine, while not directly right there in the book, he does have Edward stay out with him in the three railway engines.
Yeah.
Also, he's there for when he pulls the Queen, and he's, one of the three engines who gets to participate in that. Um, James, obviously, um, James and the Coaches exists, and then
Right.
yeah, yeah,
Right.
Old Iron's another one. The James and Edward dynamic is something I love so much, but that's not what we're talking about right now. Um, Edward was the only engine who was like actively kind and like supported Henry through his old shape, whilst everybody else mocked him. And then Edward warned Percy about the storm, being a mentor.
Yeah.
He didn't really interact with Toby, but Toby's kind of off doing his own thing most of the time on like Thomas's branch, so it makes sense there.
I
But
mean, okay, I feel like going back to what you said earlier, going back to the question, I feel like maybe Emily could step up to that. I mean, depends on what
I mean,
interpretation you want.
yeah, if you really played it, I could see there being an interpretation of Emily where she like starts out as like her season 8 persona, where she's like bossy and what have you,
Oh, for
and
sure,
sort of like
yeah.
morphs into her season 7 persona,
Yeah, almost
which
like another
honestly I would
character,
love that.
another character who Edward helped out on the arc, maybe.
Um, this is another thing that you'd have to really play it, and it's very little evidence for this in the show. But I could see there being a future where if Edward was to like retire early or like depending on the circumstance, of course, I could see James taking over as Edward. Not directly, not like right away. It would take some time, maybe a few years, but like I could see James sort of taking up Edward's role because I think of all the engines Edward's like impacted, James is one of the major ones.
Hmm.
Well, look at all
That's
the episodes
that's.
they've had together.
I mean, yeah, that
Like,
makes sense. I never really considered that. I mean, it would definitely be a long arc. James
oh yeah,
going from
definitely.
how he
But
is
like,
now to that
oh
would be
yeah, no,
crazy.
I'm almost certain that nobody else is like. I'm probably the only person who thinks this, but like, I could see
Let us know
if
in
you
the
played it
comments down
right.
below.
You think there's going to be comments on this? Uh,
We only got 3 views.
I could see James through like an arc, a very, 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 very long arc, slowly working into becoming. I don't know if wise sage is the right word, but definitely more of a straight man, like how
Yeah.
Edward was in like the earlier years. I could see James evolving into that through a very long arc.
Yeah, I mean they do have so many episodes together. They have Old Iron, they have the one hitter Billboard one,
James the second best,
others that one. Yeah.
the one hit era Billboard one. Well, like even in the hit era, like there's like signs of it. Like look at James in the second best. Like James, like that is such. It is
That's a
easily
great
in my top
episode.
10 episodes of this show. I love that
Wow.
episode so
That's
much.
crazy.
Yeah. Well, like we see James and Edward time and time again arguing. James is like, "No, I'm better than you." Edward's like, you're not." And James is like, "Yeah, whatever, old man. I don't really care." He goes on, does his arrogant thing, crashes, and it's like, "I told you so." And he's like, "I know." And then he puts things right. That's how James and episodes work. And don't get me wrong, I love that episode. I love those episodes because 9 times out of 10, it's always deserved. Correction, 11
Meanwhile,
times out of 10, it's always deserved. But James in the second best breaks the mold by having James strive to be more like Ed. Like
meanwhile,
I
if
can
it
easily
was
see it.
Toby and James,
Oh,
it would be James saying, "I'm better than you, old man." Toby being like, "Okay." James being like, "I'm better than you." Toby like, "Okay," and then James dying.
yeah, exactly. Like Toby would not react at all, and he would know that that would make James angry, and James would do something stupid, and then Toby would laugh, and nobody would progress in the slightest.
Yeah, it would just be stagnation and people getting mad at each other and Toby laughing. Meanwhile, with
Exactly.
Edward, it would actually be character development and working towards being a better version of yourself. And
Right.
that's really what Edward is all about. That's who Edward is.
Edward,
He gets characters to go in the right direction to progress further and become better versions of themselves, which oftentimes
Edward
means molding them
strives
into
for
himself.
he strives for character progression, which on an island like Sodor, I feel like that's if you didn't have Edward, you know,
I don't
the
think
stuff
Soda
would
would
be
exist anymore.
no, probably not. It would have all been destroyed and taken over by something, I'm sure. I don't know what, but would not be as peaceful as the show likes to advertise it is. What are your other thoughts on Edward, Jaden?
I mean, I feel like with Edward, he was never really meant. He could never be a main character, despite the fact that he's a straight man. That would just be too boring. Cause like Edward, while he is good at keeping others from being stupid, keeping others from being stupid isn't very entertaining, and so therefore Edward did not appear in his proper characterization very often in the later part of the show, which makes sense. I mean,
Right.
from a hetero writer's point of view, it does make sense to have the older train or just the other train just act normal and um, it
Oh,
makes sense.
an episode that I think is like a lot of people hate on the era for
Mm-hmm.
Edward being like insecure about his age and stuff.
Yeah.
But an episode that I think handles Edward making Edward insecure and it manages it well is I'm blanking on the name. The one where he has to pull the mail. Might just be Edward in the mail. I don't know. Um, whatever that one is. I think
Sure.
that works because it's like the old guy, right, who hasn't done it in like forever, is forced to do this job that he's like, yeah, I know what I'm doing, right? And like he doesn't, Edward probably doesn't know, and I don't think that's a bad thing. And like
Yeah, I mean, it
him being
goes.
like nervous to ask, like Percy, like makes sense because he's the older engine. He should know this stuff. So I could
Yeah, I
easily
mean,
see someone like Edward being insecure about it.
it goes back to what I was saying before. Edward has flaws, and you can't deny that because every character has flaws, and Edward's no different.
Right. It's just a shame Edward's flaws weren't emphasized more or used correctly.
Yeah,
So I feel like
like,
Edward could be a far more interesting character than how like the show depicts him.
yeah,
Because let's be real, Edward's stories, like on his own, aren't very interesting.
yeah.
Edward's
I
Day Out
mean,
is such a lame story.
Edward Sayo is so boring.
It is so boring. Don't get me wrong, I love it purely because of what it did for the franchise, but like if Edward was on an island of Edwards, it would be such a boring island. It would be so
Yeah.
lame. It's all full of a bunch of teachers' pets, okay? Bunch of squares. So, like, in a way,
Bunch of
Edward kind of
Tobys.
needs the conflict. Hey, he's not square. He's rectangular.
What can I say? He's square. But that's
Decagongular
besides
toe.
the point.
um, yeah, Edward's flaws.
So with Edward, basically, he's he's a mentor figure, and that's probably the most defining trait of his, other than the fact that he's a straight man. And I mean, if he wasn't there, then the other characters they would
Yeah.
there would not be a fun time on Soda. I'll give you that. Um,
Edward
and
is
yeah,
glue who holds all these conflicting engines together. Because if Edward wasn't around, the engines would probably get into big serious fights and just never talk to each other again, and the railway would work slightly less efficiently. And I feel like without Edward, the quote Steam team just wouldn't be friends. And considering what they all come to do
Yeah,
for each other and how they all work as like a found family unit, that would be a real shame. And Edward being the glue is kind of made up for him not being a major player in most of these seasons.
and I almost feel like Edward is both the most important character in this franchise and also the one character who could never be the main character.
I feel like that's a perfect way to describe Edward.
So there you go.
that's that's our take, our thoughts, our ideas on um Alice the Blue Engine.
That that was that was Trackstar's episode 1. There's
Huh.
probably more we could talk about, but I feel like it's probably better to wrap up before we go on for too long, because
Yeah.
the
And
passengers will be waiting, and the coaches will get coaches.
oh yeah, if we go on too long, the passengers will be waiting, and quite frankly, I don't want to deal with Jeremiah again. He's been such a dick
Gobbling,
recently.
oh god.
Gosh.
He's always complaining about that bootlace that we never gave back to him. Yeah, we really
Oh my God.
just, we gotta get to the station, guys. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's been nice talking to you. Thanks for the delicious
Yeah,
cocoa,
of
and
course.
we'll probably see you next time.
Wait, is that a goods train coming straight for a break van?
Break fan. We're in a passenger station. Why is there a goods train? Uh-oh.
Tilby?
Toodle peep.